It began with a smell. Not smoke, not gunpowder, but coffee. Rich, warm, unmistakably American. It drifted through the crisp morning air of central Texas, past rows of barbed wire and wooden guard towers, and into the bewildered faces of men who had once marched beneath the banners of the Reich. They were soldiers of the Wehrmacht, proud, exhausted, and newly captured from the battlefields of North Africa and Europe. Now they stood on foreign soil, in a place called Camp Swift, Texas. It was late 1944, and for the first time in years, they were not hearing the shriek of artillery but the low rumble of trucks bringing breakfast. To them, this was supposed to be the end of the world. Imprisonment in America, enemy territory, land of propaganda and supposed decadence. Their officers had warned them. American captivity would mean starvation, humiliation, and perhaps even death. But as the first pots of food were carried into the mess hall, that fear met its first contradiction. A table laid with bread still steaming from the oven. Inside the camp, the air smelled of cornbread, bacon, and black coffee. Some prisoners muttered disbelief. Others stared in silence at the plates being served. Fried eggs, boiled potatoes, oatmeal sweetened with sugar. Food that looked in their eyes like something stolen from a dream. In Germany, rations had grown thin. Soldiers at the front often lived on hard biscuits and watery stew. Even back home, families were trading coupons for crumbs. Yet here, in a land they had been taught to despise, their captors were feeding them better than the Reich had fed its own men. At first, the reaction was suspicion. "It's propaganda," some said. "They want to break our spirit with comfort." Others laughed bitterly. "Americans don't know what war means. Let them feed us now. They'll pay for it later. But hunger is stronger than pride." And as tin forks scraped against metal trays, the irony of war began to take root. Camp Swift, one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps in the United States, had been built just outside the town of Bastrop. By the autumn of 1944, its fences held over 10,000 German soldiers, many from Rommel's Afrika Korps, others from the Normandy front. The Texas sun bore down on them by day, and coyotes howled from the distant hills by night. But within those fences, a strange new world was forming, a world governed not by revenge, but by the Geneva Convention. The Americans had decided early. These men would not be starved or beaten. They would be housed, fed, and even allowed to work. For many Texans, it was an act of Christian decency. For the War Department, it was strategy. Proof that democracy treated its enemies with dignity. The first days were disorienting. Prisoners were deloused, issued uniforms stenciled with the letters PW, and lined up for medical exams. The guards, mostly young Americans, many barely out of high school, looked at the Germans not with hatred, but with curiosity. The Germans noticed everything: the clean barracks, the running water, the orderly kitchens. In one canteen, a sign listed the week's menu: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, vegetables, fruit, dessert. "Dessert," one prisoner whispered, half laughing, half in disbelief. They had been told Americans lived off canned food and chemicals. They expected watery soups and rationed meat. Instead, they were served fresh bread baked in camp, butter, jam, and even the occasional slice of pie. Some refused to eat, thinking it a trick. Others, shaking off defiance, took a cautious bite and realized with astonishment that it was real. At the neighboring Camp Hearne, north of Houston, similar scenes were unfolding. Known among prisoners as the Fritz Ritz for its surprisingly good conditions, Hearne became a world within a world. Behind the wire, Germans built gardens, orchestras, even small libraries. And in the mess halls, they tasted the full spectrum of irony: the enemy's food served without malice. The first breakfast at Hearne became legendary among the men: eggs, toast, fruit, coffee, the same meal served to American troops stationed nearby. "They feed us like their own," one prisoner wrote in his diary. If this is defeat, then it tastes strange. Yet pride died slowly. Around the campfires, older officers grumbled that it was all a manipulation, a soft war to win hearts. "Do not be fooled," one captain warned. "The Americans are fat on their illusions. They think kindness is strength. But younger soldiers, barely 20, were not so sure. For them, war had been chaos. Hunger, frostbite, endless retreat. Now, for the first time, they could sleep through the night without artillery or fear. They began to talk quietly with guards, to learn English words, to hum along when the Americans played swing records through the loudspeakers. Still, the memory of the front haunted them. The nights were long, and the sound of the trains passing near Camp Swift carried reminders of the world they'd left behind. Sometimes they'd sit outside their barracks, staring toward the faint orange glow of the distant town, imagining what freedom felt like for those on the other side of the fence. For the locals, the presence of thousands of enemy soldiers was unsettling at first. Farmers stared at convoys bringing Germans into Texas by train. But soon, curiosity overcame fear. The POWs were assigned to agricultural work, cotton picking, lumber, road repairs, tasks the Americans needed done as their own men fought overseas. And when they worked, they were fed, generously. One farmer near Bastrop later recalled, "Those boys worked hard, and they ate like kings. My own sons in Europe probably didn't have it so good. The German soldiers couldn't understand it. They had expected punishment, not abundance. They treat us like humans," one wrote in a letter never sent. "Perhaps this is their weapon, kindness." At mealtimes, the irony deepened. When Red Cross inspectors visited, they noted that the German POWs received 3,200 calories per day, more than most civilians in Germany, and sometimes even more than the guards themselves. The Americans insisted it was by the book. The Geneva Convention required equal rations for prisoners and soldiers. Still, many prisoners mocked the food at first. Too sweet, they complained. Too greasy. Too much meat. Too much milk. They laughed at American habits, the coffee, the peanut butter, the thick white bread. "They eat like children," one man joked. "No wonder they are so large." But weeks turned into months, and as German supply lines collapsed across the Atlantic, news filtered into the camps. News of hunger, bombings, and cities turned to dust. The laughter faded. Letters from home spoke of shortages so dire that even soldiers' families were going hungry. Then, one morning at Camp Hearne, something changed. A young guard, Private James Hollis, arrived at the mess hall early. He noticed a few German prisoners sitting quietly, waiting before breakfast was served. One of them, a tall blond man in his 20s, rose and approached him. In halting English, he asked, "Please, coffee?" Hollis nodded, poured a cup, and handed it over. The man took it carefully, as though it were something sacred. He didn't drink right away. He smelled it first, eyes half closed, and whispered, "Thank you." Hollis later said that in that moment he understood something. The war might still be raging across oceans, but here, inside the barbed wire, something human was winning. By late 1944, as Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble, many of these men, once proud soldiers of the Reich, began to see America differently. They watched movies in camp theaters, saw newsreels of the D-Day landings, and listened to radio broadcasts. They realized the barbaric enemy they'd been told about was, in many ways, more civilized than their own collapsing homeland. And yet, the irony remained sharp. The more they mocked the Americans' abundance, the more they came to rely on it. In Camp Swift, one guard recalled how prisoners used to scoff at American canned meat. Spam, they called it, pink rubber. But months later, when a shipment was delayed, the same men begged for it. They said it reminded them of home. Christmas 1944 arrived with unexpected warmth. At Camp Hearne, prisoners built small Christmas trees from scrap wood and paper. The Americans provided extra rations, turkey, cranberry sauce, chocolate. For many of the men, it was the first time in years they'd celebrated without fear of air raids. Some cried quietly as they ate. Others sang carols in German, their voices blending with the wind that carried across the Texas plains. The guards listened from a distance, unsure whether to smile or weep. By January 1945, the war in Europe was almost over, though the men behind the wire did not yet know it. What they did know was simpler, more immediate, that food could be more than sustenance. It could be mercy, and for men who had been taught that mercy was weakness, that realization was the beginning of something profound. Inside those fences, surrounded by miles of Texas scrub and the long horizon of an alien land, the defeated began to taste the first hint of what victory might mean. Not the kind won by armies, but the kind found in humanity itself. And in that taste, of coffee, of cornbread, of kindness, a question began to form that would follow them long after the war was over. If the enemy feeds you like a brother, who is the barbarian now? By early 1945, the fences of Camp Hearne no longer looked like a prison. They looked like a paradox. Inside, thousands of defeated German soldiers built a world within a world where discipline, pride, and hunger collided with abundance, decency, and doubt. The Americans called it Camp Hearne. The Germans called it Die kleine Stadt, the little city. To them, it was a place that should not exist, a land where the enemy treated them better than their own leaders ever had. At dawn, the Texas sky stretched wide and pale over endless flat fields. The air smelled of cedar and dust. Somewhere in the distance, the whistle of a freight train rose and faded, a haunting reminder that life outside the wire continued as normal. Every morning, the prisoners lined up for roll call, their khaki uniforms marked PW, but the mood was changing. Gone was the terror of the first days. In its place grew something strange and unspoken, respect, perhaps even gratitude. For breakfast, they were served eggs, toast, and bacon, the same rations eaten by American troops stationed nearby. For lunch, beans, potatoes, and meat. For dinner, stews thick with vegetables, occasionally even ice cream on Sundays. To German soldiers raised on scarcity and hierarchy, it felt like an alternate universe, and at its center was irony. The same men who had marched under banners proclaiming German superiority now found themselves outdone in every measure of civilization by the very enemy they had been taught to despise. At first, they mocked it to save face. They called Camp Hearne the Fritz Ritz, a joke among men too proud to admit their disbelief. But the name stuck. It spread through letters home, through whispered conversations with guards. And soon, the name took on a different meaning. Not derision, but awe. Inside the camp, the prisoners created a life. They built small theaters, stages for plays and music. They painted murals on the barracks walls, landscapes of the Rhine, portraits of loved ones, even scenes of imagined peace. They organized orchestras, taught language classes, and published a handwritten newspaper. And in the kitchens, always the kitchens, they discovered that even defeat could taste like redemption. The American mess staff followed military efficiency. Meals came like clockwork, hot, ample, and fair. But within months, the Germans were allowed to work alongside the cooks, preparing their own bread, sausages, soups, using ingredients provided by the U.S. Army. It was in those kitchens that the great transformation began. At first, many prisoners sneered at American ingredients: canned fruit, cornmeal, peanut butter. They joked that it was food for pigs. But the Americans shrugged and let them laugh, because every day those same men came back for seconds. They began to experiment, mixing German recipes with American supplies. One day, it was sauerkraut with canned beef. Another, pancakes made with cornstarch and apple jam. Slowly, the line between their food and our food blurred. It was a quiet diplomacy, carried out over stoves and cutting boards. A German cook named Heinrich Miller later wrote, At first, we believed American food had no soul, too sweet, too rich. But in time, I realized it had something our kitchens had lost: generosity. Generosity. That word echoed in the hearts of many who ate behind those fences. The camp library carried American novels translated into German: Steinbeck, Hemingway, even Mark Twain. They read about freedom, hardship, and humanity in words they'd never been allowed to read before. Outside the wire, American farmers who employed POWs in the fields often shared their lunches. Simple things: sandwiches, fruit, coffee in tin cups, and almost every time the Germans would comment on the taste. One Texas farmer recalled years later they couldn't get over the bread, said it was too soft, too white. I told them that's just how we like it. A week later, they were asking for seconds. Something subtle was happening, a shift not just of palate, but of perception. Food became the language of a larger realization that America was not the barbaric enemy painted in Nazi propaganda, but a land built on abundance and fairness. The prisoners began to compare. In Germany, the SS hoarded food while civilians starved. Soldiers at the front received dwindling rations, and propaganda told them it was noble to suffer. In America, even prisoners were fed with dignity. It was a moral blow more devastating than any bomb. When news reached Hearne and Swift of the liberation of concentration camps, of Buchenwald, Dachau, and others, disbelief turned to silence. Many refused to believe it. Others sat in stunned quiet, staring into their plates, unable to reconcile the cruelty of their homeland with the kindness of their captors. For some, the food became a form of penance. They ate in silence, aware that every bite they took in Texas was one their families could not have in Germany. Letters home were censored, but even within those limits, emotion bled through. "We are treated fairly," one man wrote, "perhaps too fairly." Another said, "Tell my mother not to worry. I am healthy, even fat." America is not what we thought, but not everyone welcomed the awakening. Among the prisoners, Nazi loyalists still held sway. They formed secret groups, enforcing ideological discipline. They accused others of becoming American, of betrayal. Those who accepted American kindness too easily were labeled soft or rotten. In some barracks, fights broke out, not over food, but over belief. Could decency be an enemy's weapon? Could mercy be a trap? In one notorious incident at Camp Hearne, a young corporal named Franz was caught talking with an American guard about jazz music and movies. That night, other prisoners cornered him and beat him severely, warning that friendship with the enemy was treason. The camp command intervened, isolating the extremists and separating hardliners from moderates. But the damage was done. The fences of the camp now divided more than just nations. They divided hearts. Even so, kindness persisted. The American officers understood that re-education could not come through lectures. It came through daily life, through work, fairness, and food. At Camp Swift, Major Ralph Franklin oversaw the mess operations. He insisted the Germans eat the same meals as U.S. troops, even when supply shortages made it difficult. "If we start cutting corners," he said, "we become the thing we're fighting." His stance was not popular with everyone. Some locals resented feeding the enemy so well while families in town still rationed sugar and meat. But Franklin stood firm. "They will remember how we treated them," he said. "That's worth more than any ration card." And they did remember. One afternoon in February 1945, a convoy of trucks brought a shipment of fresh oranges, a rare luxury even for Americans at that time. The prisoners watched as the boxes were unloaded, expecting to see them carried to the officers' mess. Instead, the guards wheeled them straight into the POW kitchens. That evening, each man received a single orange. The smell of citrus filled the barracks, sharp and sweet against the dry Texas air. Many had not seen fresh fruit in years. Some saved theirs, too beautiful to eat. Others peeled slowly, savoring every drop. One diary entry from that night reads simply, "Tonight, I ate an orange. I had forgotten the color of happiness." As the months wore on, word spread through the camp grapevine that the war was ending. Radios, secretly built from smuggled parts, brought snippets of news. Hitler hiding in Berlin, Allies advancing on all fronts. And still, 3 times a day the smell of bread and coffee rose from the kitchens. In that consistency, the Germans found something they hadn't known for years: stability. The war had taken everything: their homes, their honor, their illusions. But here, in the enemy's land, they were rediscovering normalcy. Some began to work with American guards, helping maintain the camp gardens or fixing machinery. Others volunteered to work outside the fence, harvesting crops. Farmers often invited them to share lunch under the shade of oak trees. Conversations began, halting at first, then warmer. "What will you do after the war?" one might ask. "Go home," came the reply, "if there's still a home left." The food bridged what words could not. Sandwiches shared in silence became gestures of peace. By spring, the men at Hearne had grown noticeably healthier. Their cheeks filled out, their eyes brightened. The irony was painful. They looked more alive as prisoners than they had as free soldiers. One guard described it best. "They arrived broken and hungry. Now they whistle when they work." That spring, the mess hall served something new: hamburgers. The Americans called it a treat. The Germans called it strange. They bit into the soft buns, the grilled meat, the melted cheese. Some smiled, others asked for seconds. Within weeks, they were trying to make their own. There was laughter again, faint but real, and beneath it, something deeper: acceptance. When Victory in Europe Day finally came in May 1945, the camp erupted in a strange silence. There were no cheers, no shouts of joy, only a long, collective exhale. The guards lowered the flag to half-mast for the dead, then raised it again in the wind. The Germans stood watching, uncertain whether to feel grief or relief. At lunchtime, the kitchen served fried chicken and pie, a celebration meal. Some prisoners refused to eat, mourning their fallen comrades. Others, after long thought, joined the line. As they ate, many wept quietly, not for the lost war, but for the realization that the world they had believed in was gone, and perhaps that was not such a tragedy. For them, the irony had come full circle. The food they once mocked had become their comfort. The enemy they once hated had shown them mercy, and in that mercy, they began to rediscover what it meant to be human. By the summer of 1945, Texas shimmered beneath a heat that seemed to hum in the air itself. The war was over. The guns of Europe had fallen silent, but inside the wire, time still held its breath. At Camp Swift and Camp Hearne, the German prisoners now lived in a strange twilight between captivity and freedom. The guards no longer shouted orders. The searchlights no longer burned through the night. Trucks rolled in and out, carrying men whose numbers dwindled with each passing week. They knew the end was coming. Repatriation. A word that sounded hopeful, but also terrifying. For many, America had become something they could not name. Not home, not enemy, but a mirror. A mirror showing what the world might look like without fear. And behind that reflection was the smell that had haunted them since the day they arrived: coffee. Each morning, that same rich aroma filled the camp. It was routine now, comforting, but beneath its warmth lay an ache. They were leaving soon, and they would never taste this coffee again. The camp routine persisted even as it dissolved. The orchestra played in the evenings, sermons were still held on Sundays. But talk of the future grew quieter. Men sat on the barrack steps, watching trains snake across the distant plains, wondering what waited for them beyond the Atlantic. When word came that they would be shipped to England first, to await transport back to Germany, many wept. Not from joy, but uncertainty. What was home now? Cities in ruins, families scattered, streets renamed. And what did it mean to return to a nation that had promised greatness but delivered ash and shame? At Camp Hearne, a farewell ceremony was organized. The Americans provided one last feast: turkey, potatoes, gravy, and the same thick slices of apple pie that had once seemed ridiculous to German tongues. That evening, the prisoners ate slowly, savoring every bite, knowing it was their last taste of America. Some saved crusts of bread as keepsakes, others folded napkins into small triangles to carry in their pockets. After the meal, they stood together in silence as the camp orchestra played Silent Night. It was August, but the song fit. The melody drifted into the hot air, over the wire, across the mesquite and cedar, until it disappeared into the wide Texas dark. For a moment, even the guards bowed their heads. The next morning, buses lined up outside the camp gate. The men boarded in silence. The guards checked names and handed out sandwiches for the trip: white bread, ham, cheese, an apple, a chocolate bar. One soldier, formerly an NCO in the Africa Corps, paused before boarding. He looked at the guard handing him his lunch and said softly, "If you ever come to Germany, I will feed you." The guard smiled, but the German didn't. His eyes glistened. "No," he said, "I mean it." As the buses pulled away, clouds of dust rose behind them, and the camp seemed to exhale. The fences remained, but the silence felt different now. Not oppressive, but empty. At Camp Swift, where many others still waited their turn, the mood was the same. Men wrote letters they would never send. They drew maps of cities that no longer existed. And always they remembered the meals: the bread, the oranges, the coffee. Those simple things had become proof that humanity could survive even a world war. When they finally arrived in Germany months later, reality struck like winter. Their homeland was unrecognizable: flattened cities, burned bridges, hunger everywhere. Children scavenged in rubble, mothers queued for soup. Men stood in silence among ruins that smelled of smoke and despair. The POWs returned changed. They had lived in a land where prisoners ate 3 times a day, where guards shared cigarettes and laughter, where even the defeated were treated with dignity. Now they came home to a nation starving and broken, still clinging to bitterness. Many could not bear to speak of America. It sounded like fantasy. But slowly the stories spread: of Camp Hearne, of Camp Swift, of food so plentiful it bordered on miraculous. Neighbors called them liars. The Americans would never feed Germans like that, they said. But the returned men simply smiled and answered, they did. Historians would later note that of all Axis prisoners held worldwide, those in the United States had among the lowest mortality rates and the highest morale. But statistics could never capture what truly happened behind the wire: the quiet undoing of hatred, one meal at a time. One former prisoner, Hans Schreiber, later became a baker in Bremen. He hung a small framed photograph in his shop, a faded picture of Camp Hearne's kitchen. Below it, he wrote in English, "Bread is peace." Another, Kurt Menzel, who had once mocked the Americans for their sweet food, spent years trying to recreate their coffee. He never quite managed it. "Maybe it was not the coffee," he said once. "Maybe it was the feeling." In letters and memoirs that surfaced decades later, a recurring image appeared: that first morning smell of bacon and coffee, the disbelief, the irony. Again and again, they wrote of how it forced them to question everything they'd been taught. Some admitted shame, others gratitude. Most expressed confusion. How could the enemy be so humane? A former SS sergeant who passed through Camp Swift confessed in a post-war interview, "It was easier to fight Americans than to understand them." For many, the American meal became a metaphor. It wasn't just food, it was forgiveness, served daily, quietly, without speeches or banners. And that forgiveness planted seeds that would outlive the fences. When West Germany began rebuilding, some of those same men advocated for democracy, education, and human rights. A few even wrote to their old guards, sending thanks, photographs of families, sometimes recipes. The circle had closed. Back in Texas, the camps themselves disappeared. The barracks were torn down, the fields reclaimed by grass. Where guard towers once stood, cows grazed under open sky. Only faint traces remained: concrete foundations, rusted nails, the outline of a mess hall floor. Yet on still mornings when the wind moves through Bastrop County, locals say you can almost smell it, that faint, ghostly scent of coffee drifting across the plains. For those who know the story, it is a scent heavy with irony and grace, because the story of Camp Swift and Camp Hearne was never just about war. It was about what happens when mercy confronts hate, when the victors feed their enemies, and in doing so, feed something far greater. In that act, ladling soup, slicing bread, pouring coffee, America defeated not just an army, but an idea. The idea that cruelty is strength, that compassion is weakness. When the fences finally came down, many of those German soldiers stepped into freedom carrying a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was the hunger to understand how a nation could win without hatred. Years later, at reunions held in Germany and even in Texas, the old men who had once been enemies sat together again. They laughed, shared photographs, and always talked about the food. One of them raised a cup of coffee, steam curling into the air, and said softly, "To the cooks." They showed us what victory really tastes like. The others nodded. The moment lingered, tender, wordless. Outside, the wind moved gently across the Texas fields, carrying the ghosts of that long-ago morning, the laughter, the disbelief, the smell of bread baking behind the wire. History remembers wars for the battles that ended them. But sometimes, peace begins in the quiet places, in kitchens, in canteens, in the simple act of feeding a stranger. And long after the uniforms are gone and the flags are folded away, what remains are the small, human mercies that refused to die. The war had taught the world many things about destruction, but in 2 quiet camps in Texas, it also taught something else, that the true taste of victory is kindness.